The courtyard was silent except for the faint clink of metal and the slow, shallow breaths of a man in pain. Sergeant Hartley stood rigid in his crimson coat, his ankle torn open inside his boot, blood seeping into the leather. He'd been there for hours, locked in the unbroken stance the crown demanded, even as the cold bit and the wound throbbed. No one moved to help him. No one even noticed. Until two young heirs stepped across the invisible line that separates ceremony from reality and changed everything. Stay until the end, because what Princess Charlotte and Prince George did that day wasn't just an act of kindness, it was a quiet defiance the palace will never fully explain. The first sign of trouble was almost invisible. A slight shift of weight, a tremor running down the rigid spine of a man trained never to show weakness. The courtyard of Buckingham Palace was wrapped in a grey, winter stillness that morning breath turned to mist, boots crunched faintly on the frost-bitten stones. The crowd stood hushed, eyes fixed on the row of crimson coats and black bearskin hats. They didn't notice. Not yet. But something was wrong. One guard's ankle was already bleeding inside his boot, and the blood was pooling with every heartbeat. 3 hours. That's how long he would stand before anyone moved to help him. And when help came, it would not come from the people you might expect. It would come from two children born into a world of ceremony and steel, children who had seen more masks than truths. What they did next would ripple through the palace like a crack in glass. Stay with me until the very end, because the way this story ends will change the way you look at the young heirs forever. The injury happened fast, too fast for anyone to react. Sergeant Alan Hartley, 38 years old, 10 years in service to the Coldstream Guards, had taken his position as he had 1,000 times before. The morning drill was sharp, unforgiving, one misplaced step could snap the perfect rhythm. As he pivoted into line, his heel caught on a cracked cobblestone. The weight of his body drove the ankle sideways. He heard the tear before he felt the pain: leather, skin, muscle. His vision flashed white for a second. He straightened instantly, hiding the limp, eyes dead ahead. The blood came next. Warm, sticky, sliding over the top of his sock inside the boot. But the uniform was a prison of dignity, the rigid tunic, the weight of the rifle against his shoulder, the invisible order drilled into him from the first day of training: you do not break. Not for weather. Not for pain. Not for blood. By the time the gates opened, Hartley's leg felt like it was burning from the inside. The tourists surged forward with their phones, oblivious to the private hell playing out behind the mask of discipline. Somewhere in that blur of faces, a pair of eyes were watching more closely than the rest. Princess Charlotte had always had a sharp gaze, one that lingered where most people glanced. She spotted it before her brother did: the unnatural tension in the guard's jaw, the too still shoulders, the faint dark line seeping from the edge of his boot. George noticed next, but said nothing at first. Inside these walls, you didn't shout when you saw something wrong. You learned to watch, to measure, to choose your moment. The ceremony dragged on. The military band's music rattled the air, but the sound seemed to bounce off Hartley like distant thunder. His hands were numb now, his ankle was swollen inside the boot, the cut grinding against the leather with every shift of weight. Each second stretched, silent and merciless, until time lost its shape. Inside the palace, the royals prepared for their entrance. The children stood in the marbled hall, straight-backed, hands clasped, the picture of obedience. But Charlotte's mind wasn't in the hall. It was out there, in the cold, fixed on the man who hadn't moved in over an hour. When the family emerged into the courtyard, the crowd roared. It was the noise Hartley had been holding out for, the distraction he needed to steady his focus. But as Charlotte passed within 20 feet of him, her eyes locked on his boots. Her mother's hand pressed gently on her back to keep her moving, but Charlotte twisted her head until the guard vanished from view. Minutes later, when the official greetings began, she slipped from her place beside Catherine and cut through the fringe of aides. She found one, a tall man in a navy coat, and spoke quickly, her voice sharp for someone her age. "The guard near the west gate, he's bleeding." The aide hesitated, half smiling as if it were a child's imagination. George appeared beside her, voice low but heavy with certainty. "We've both seen it. It's bad. Do something now." What followed was a chain of silent decisions, none of them written in the ceremonial handbook. An officer stepped forward, murmured something to a soldier in waiting. Hartley saw the signal in his peripheral vision, the subtle tilt of a chin, and knew his watch was ending. Relief flooded him, but with it came a dangerous wave of dizziness. When the replacement stepped in, Hartley's knees almost buckled. He made it to the shadows before anyone in the crowd saw him falter. In a quiet side courtyard, the medic worked fast. Boot off, sock peeled away, ankle swollen and raw, the cut deep enough to require stitches. The cold air stung the exposed skin. Hartley was staring at the ground when two shadows fell over him. It was them. No cameras, no photographers, just George and Charlotte, small in the doorway against the winter light. Charlotte stepped forward first, pulling a folded white handkerchief from her coat pocket. The initials CM were embroidered in silver thread. She placed it next to the medic without a word. George didn't hand anything over. Instead, he stood behind the bench, one hand on Hartley's shoulder, eyes level. "You didn't move," he said. "Even when you could have." Hartley glanced up, and for the first time since the injury, the mask cracked. He saw in George's face something he hadn't expected, not pity, but recognition. The palace had ways of controlling a story, but this one slipped through their fingers. By the time the press office issued its first statement, a bland acknowledgement of a minor medical situation during ceremonial duties, the public had already built its own narrative. The photos were everywhere: Charlotte's small hand near the guard's bloodied ankle, George's unflinching stare at the man who had refused to yield. The images were raw, unpolished, and impossible to ignore. Inside the palace, the air turned colder than the January wind outside. The incident had drawn a kind of attention no one had planned for, and not all of it was welcome. There were mutterings among senior courtiers that the moment, however touching, had compromised the ceremonial distance between the royal family and the soldiers. The old guard didn't like blurred lines. They thrived on separation, on the sense that the crown stood apart, above. But the younger generation? They were different. And that difference made the traditionalists uneasy. In the guards' barracks, Sergeant Hartley felt the shift immediately. Some of the men clapped him on the back, calling him the Iron Man for lasting so long. Others avoided his gaze, as if the attention he'd drawn had made him a liability. There was a long-standing rule among the Queen's Guard: you served without becoming the story. Hartley had broken that rule without meaning to. It wasn't just the stares that followed him now, it was the questions. Why didn't you call for relief sooner? Did you know they were watching you? What did they say to you? Hartley gave the same answer each time: I did my job. But the truth was harder to admit, even to himself. He'd felt their eyes on him before they approached. He'd known they'd noticed. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that had made it impossible to step down. A week later, a plain envelope arrived for him at the barracks. No stamp, no address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short, looping line of handwriting: "We saw. We remember." No signature. He burned it that night in the small metal bin by his bunk, but the words stayed. As winter deepened, the story began to fade from the headlines, replaced by fresher scandals and political dramas. But inside the palace, it never really disappeared. The king had met with his grandchildren privately, and though no details leaked, the whispers among staff suggested it was not a simple praise session. Some claimed he had warned them about breaking the veil, the invisible curtain between the royal family and the men who guarded them. Others said he had simply told them to be careful, because noticing too much could make enemies. Charlotte, for her part, didn't seem shaken. If anything, she became sharper, more observant in public appearances. George grew quieter, his glances lingering longer on the faces around him. Both carried themselves with the same calm composure, but those who had seen the courtyard moment knew it had changed them. For Hartley, the change was more physical. The ankle healed slowly, stiff in the mornings, aching during long watches. But the real wound was the one no medic could treat, the gnawing sense that his moment of human weakness had made him a symbol without his consent. He'd been reduced to an image in the public's mind: the stoic guard, the bleeding ankle, the royal children's compassion. No one cared about the hours of duty before or after. It was in late March, during an unseasonably cold morning at the palace gates, that Hartley saw them again. No cameras this time. No crowds. Just a small private arrival for an internal meeting. The black cars slid past, but the rear window of one lowered slightly as it passed him. Charlotte's face appeared for a brief moment, her eyes locking on his. No smile. No wave. Just the same measured, knowing look as before. The car was gone in seconds, but the air felt heavier. That look wasn't one of a child anymore. It was the look of someone who remembered and intended to. Unease lingered among the old guard. Some officers called the incident a lucky PR moment. Others saw it as a warning the next generation might not play by the same rules. Twice, Hartley was asked by superiors to recount exactly what the children had said. He gave only the bare facts, leaving out the weight in George's words and the deliberate way Charlotte had acted. Some truths, he thought, were better kept off the record. By summer, Hartley had returned fully to ceremonial duty, but the memory of that winter morning stayed with him. At times, standing motionless in the courtyard, he caught himself scanning the crowd, not for threats, but for those sharp young eyes watching him again. The palace thrived on what the public saw. The real story was always in what they didn't: the cold mornings, the pain behind the posture, the unspoken moments that never made the news. The crown had shifted that January day. Small changes always start as cracks. Heat pressed on the courtyard by July, waking the old ache in his ankle. He learned to breathe through it, blending pain into discipline. The palace, too, adapted: speeches warmer, photos looser, but there was still one thing they couldn't choreograph: the look in the heir's eyes. It unsettled traditionalists, hinting at a part of the crown that couldn't be managed or predicted. One stormy afternoon, Hartley crossed a portrait-lined corridor and froze at the private painting he'd once avoided, Charlotte kneeling with her handkerchief, George's hand on his shoulder, the injury painted with painful accuracy. It wasn't himself he was seeing, but what the two of them had already learned to carry. A valet appeared and led him to a small room where Prince William, jacket off, greeted him without ceremony. "Thank you for doing your duty," he said. "And for letting my children do theirs." Hartley replied simply, "They needed no permission from me." William nodded. "Exactly. There will be times they notice what others ignore. That won't always be comfortable. But I hope there will be people like you nearby who understand the difference between attention and truth." The meeting lasted minutes, but when Hartley left, the painting felt heavier, as though part of it now rested in his chest. By autumn, the sky had turned pewter and rain beaded on the railings. Through a palace window, Hartley glimpsed a small figure, Charlotte, or someone like her, watching with an unblinking gaze. He straightened, not taller, but truer. Old guard mutters continued, lines are blurring. The monarchy survives by distance. Yet beneath the ice, small acts of respect spread: a footman's embroidered handkerchief, a young trooper's quiet request for guidance, a medic's subtle gesture. In November at Windsor, the castle sat in mist. Hartley's post faced the slope, the cold gripping his ankles. At dusk, the royal party crossed the yard. Charlotte led, George beside her, their steps matched. As they passed, she tilted her head almost imperceptibly. He held his stone posture but let his eyes soften, just enough for her to see. For a heartbeat, January returned, the medic's hands, the boot peeled away, the folded handkerchief. And then the moment passed with the air. That night brought ice. The stones glazed over, the kind of slick that tricks muscle memory and punishes pride. On his second watch, a young guard 2 positions down, new, pale, all nerve, faltered. It wasn't dramatic. Just a misstep in the turn, a half-swallowed gasp. Hartley didn't move. The line didn't break. The world, and the tourists, didn't notice. But he could feel the panic traveling along the formation like static. He pitched his voice into the tiny space allowed by regulation without letting it carry, breathed through it. The words dissolved in the wind before they reached the railings. The young guard steadied. The line held. Pain remembered pain, and duty recognized its own reflection. Later, alone in the barracks, Hartley took out his box. Inside were the things a life reduces to when the photographs are someone else's: old letters folded to foxed edges, a dull coin, 2 button backs, and a slip of ivory card with no signature, the one he'd told himself he'd burned but hadn't. "We saw," We remember. He held it between his fingers until the kitchen clock 2 corridors away chimed 9, then returned it to the box as if returning a charge to the magazine of a rifle. Winter arrived as a fact. Snow came to the palace the way silence comes to a church, abruptly, without apology. The courtyard became a page without ink except where Boots and Wheels had scrawled a few urgent lines. Hartley took his post on a morning so white and still it felt staged. Breath rose, hung, and fell again. Somewhere in the square, a child laughed, then was hushed. The band's brass coughed and then cleared, bringing the first notes into the cold air. He didn't feel heroic. He didn't feel like an image. He felt like a man who knew the difference between standing and merely staying upright. He felt the ankle complain once, twice, then quiet as the body negotiated with the weather. He felt the weight of the bearskin press down, the gentle, constant suppression that taught you to be more aware of the world because you were doing less in it. They came out after the music. Not as a flock, but as a narrow line, William and Catherine, and the children between them like commas. The wind carried the faint sound of a voice too far away to parse, just enough to know it wasn't for the public but for the people walking at their sides. As they crossed the yard, the horizon was a white seam. The figures seemed to stitch it together. Charlotte's eyes found him, not breaking step, not inviting notice, simply marking a fixed point in the geometry of the morning. George's gaze followed, a fraction later, with the same old steadiness that had once loosened something in Hartley he hadn't recognized as fear. They didn't signal. Neither did he. The moment passed between them like a hand extended in a crowded room and pressed once before letting go. A gust lifted powder from the stones and flung it across the square. In the brightness, pain and pride and protocol met in the same pale space, and none of them needed to win for the others to hold. Hartley inhaled through the sting of air, and the breath carried a sentence without words: stand your post. See those who stand theirs. When the line of royals reached the archway, the last of them turned their heads slightly, as if listening for something behind them. Maybe it was the band. Maybe it was the collective murmur of a city that never learned to whisper in winter. Or maybe it was nothing at all. The gate swallowed them the way time swallows days. The courtyard went quiet again. And there it was, the ending the story had been walking toward since January, not loud, not final, but absolute. A guard at attention in a valley of cold light. 2 young heirs who would one day wear the weight of history the way the bearskin wore the snow. No speeches. No applause. Only the knowledge threaded through the moment like wire, that duty is not theatrical, and compassion does not need a balcony to be seen. Snow gathered on his shoulders until the red of the tunic became a deeper shade, until the rifle's metal cooled from touch to cymbal. Hartley did not move. He did not need to. Across the white, the memory of a handkerchief, the press of a steady palm on his shoulder, and a pair of eyes that had learned early how to see, burned with a clarity that weather could not smother. We saw. We remember. The wind shifted. The hour turned. And the crown, less distant than it had been, more human than it pretended, breathed out into the winter and held. The medic wrapped the ankle, using Charlotte's handkerchief as an extra layer over the dressing. When they left, neither child said goodbye. They simply nodded, as if acknowledging a pact only the 3 of them understood. By nightfall, the palace was buzzing. Not the public. Not yet. Inside, among the guards, the staff, the aides, people were talking about the heirs who had noticed what no one else had. Some said it showed compassion. Others whispered it showed something more dangerous in a royal awareness. The ability to see through the pageantry and act on what was real. The next morning, the photos appeared. Someone, somewhere, had taken them. And once the world saw Charlotte kneeling beside a bleeding guard, and George standing like a sentinel over him, there was no containing the story. Like and subscribe for more updates.